Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for a special Veterans Day MACRI talk. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould. I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, and I want to welcome tonight's MACRI talk guest, Dave Gutierrez, author of Patriots from the Barrio. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Sarah.
Yeah. For those of you who are watching from home, please let us know where you're joining from in the chat. And if over the course of this conversation you have any questions, you can put those in the chat too, and we will try to answer all of the questions throughout the conversation or at least by the end of the conversation. So let me tell you a little bit about tonight's guest. Tonight we are joined by Dave Gutierrez, a historian, writer, and the author of the book Patriots from the Barrio, which has been named one of the top 24 history books of all time by Book Riot. His articles have appeared in publications including the American Legion and War History Online. This book has been recognized by both the Texas Military Forces Museum in Austin and the National World War II Museum in New Orleans for its groundbreaking work on Company E, the 141st Infantry. Dave also specializes in genealogical research, Mexican American history, and World War II studies. He is a member of the National Medal of Honor Museum's advisory panel. So, welcome, Dave, and happy Veterans Day.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for having me. And thanks to the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute for hosting this and for be able to share my story with your audience. So again, thank you very much. And really, what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about what inspired me to write the book. I had a relative who served in this very unique and historical U.S. Army unit, and I grew up listening to my dad tell stories about a cousin of ours named Ramon Gutierrez from Del Rio, Texas. Now, my family is all came from Del Rio. I happened to be the first one born in San Jose, California, when my parents migrated out there looking for work. But I grew up hearing stories of my dad talk about his cousin that he had served in the army during World War II, had been captured twice by the German army, escaped both times, making it back across Allied lines. He would become one of only a few Americans to be decorated for valor on the battlefield by the Soviet Union during World War II. So I knew this growing up. And as I got older and I started doing genealogical research on our family, I started running into newspaper articles on my cousin Ramon. And I was learning even more from him, from the articles, from what my dad had told me. Now I've got these new articles. And I go and meet a cousin of mine who's living in San Jose. I'd never met this cousin, but we reached out to each other through Ancestry.com.
Mm-hmm.
And we started talking a little bit about Ramon. And when I left her mom's house that day, I realized, why hasn't anyone ever put this man's story together? And I had never written a book before, but I thought it was such an important subject that I should at least attempt to write his story.
Mm-hmm.
And then it took me 5 years of research of writing this. And again, this was the first book I had ever written. So most of the research was, how do you write a book, Dave? So through historical research, I learned that my cousin had served in Company E, 141st Infantry of the 36th Division, the Texas Division. Now, this unit was originally a Texas National Guard unit out of El Paso, Texas. And there were two National Guard units in El Paso in 1939. Company H was an all-white unit, and Company E was a completely segregated unit made up of all the men from the barrios of El Paso. And then I started to think about, wow, I can't just tell my cousin's story. I got to tell all of these men's story. And really, after 5 years of research, I learned that this unit went on to serve in North Africa. They fought in some of the most brutal battles in Italy during World War II, and we can get into those little individual stories as we go. And then the unit was decimated at the crossing of the Rapido River, where nearly the entire unit was wiped out uh, in Italy in January of 1944. But I thought that this was such an important story that as I got connected with these families of the men that served with my cousin, I felt a strong obligation to tell their story as well. And after 5 years of research, during those 5 years, I connected with over 60 different families of the men that served with my cousin in World War II.
Wow, that's amazing. And honestly, you said, "Oh, it took me 5 years." I don't know that it's that long, considering that you'd never done this before and that you had to connect with all these different people.
Yeah, it was a lot of the historical piece was quite easy for me because I was an avid reader, and that's probably one of the things that really helped me in writing this book is that I always had a book in my hand, and I was always reading different authors, different genres, and when you do that and when you read like that, you get to see how the different authors structure their stories and things like
Mhm.
that. So I think I had a leg up because I was an avid reader, but again, the historical piece was fascinating, and then again the connection to these Mexican American families,
Yeah.
and many of them, they lost their loved one out there. They made the ultimate sacrifice for this country, and really the sacrifice that they made is for the very freedoms that we all enjoy today.
Right. So, in addition to your cousin, who are some of the individuals who you learned about who really stick out for you?
Yeah, so really, there was one in particular that I'll start off with is Rafael Torres. Sergeant Rafael Torres was one of 6 brothers serving in the United States military during World War II. And his last name is Torres, and he lived in El Paso. It's very hard to find one Torres family in El Paso, Texas, let me tell you. But after a few years, I connected with his granddaughter, Sonia, who was living out in Iowa. And I found her only because she was blogging about her grandfather. And I'm
Hmm.
like, wow, here finally is the connection that I have. And we made some phone calls and exchanged emails. And then later on, she would tell me, Dave, my grandfather, he wrote his memoirs. And I have those, and I'd like to send them to you because I have them here. And nobody's done with anything with these, so I expected a few pages. She sent me 200 pages of
Wow.
Rafael Torres's personal memoirs, and really throughout the book, you get to read what Rafael Torres was actually thinking about, everything that was happening to him. And this guy was wounded on several occasions and was nearly killed. And as a matter of fact, when he was wounded at San Pedro, many of the men that were walking by him while he was laying there thought he was dead. And Rafael Torres lived to be in his 90s.
Hmm.
But
Wow.
yeah, that was an important piece. Connections like that. Alex Carrillo, who had served in the weapons platoon of Company E, his son was easy to find in El Paso. His name is Alex Carrillo Jr. So I was able to connect with he was the first family member that I connected with. And Alex Carrillo Jr. sent me an entire box of everything that his father had done in the war, including religious medallions that he had carried, that was given to him by the priest. there in the U.S. Army and things like that. And I thought to myself, if I find just a few more of these families, I could be able to really tell their story. And lo and behold, it just went on and it just snowballed. As you get through one family, you get to another and another. Eduardo Romo from El Paso, Texas, was serving as a platoon sergeant and was leading the men across the Rapido River. Now, Eduardo Romo also had brothers in the U.S. Army fighting during World War II. Eduardo Romo was captured at the Rapido River, would spend nearly 16 months in German POW camp during that time. So those are some of the people. Now, I mentioned that Company E was an entirely segregated unit. Now, in 1940, the unit was federalized, and the entire 36th Division went to Camp Bowie in Brownwood, Texas. And this is prior to Pearl Harbor. But what the Texas National Guard did was they actually pulled out other veterans, Mexican-American veterans from other units, like from San Antonio. In the San Antonio area there, Rudy Trevino and Ted Rodriguez were serving with that unit in San Antonio. They were moved to Company E because they were Mexican, right? Now, we did have Mexican-Americans serving in other units within the 36th Division. One in particular, Eduardo Valenzuela from Alpine, Texas, was serving in Company H in the 142nd Division. So we had other Mexican Americans serving in other units. But that's what made Company E very special to me, because it was the only such unit that was like this. And you look at the roster of these men. Now, all the officers were Anglo, right? But every enlisted man of Company E was of Mexican-American descent.
Wow. So as you are learning about these different men and their lives and what their experience was in the war, I guess what I'm curious about is that idea that the military offers an opportunity for all kinds of people, but certainly for Mexican Americans. Did you see traces of that as you were mapping out these different lives?
Yes. So this is a Texas National Guard unit. So a lot of these men were serving in the Texas National Guard in way back from 1939, because the National Guard was paying them $21 a month to serve. And that was a lot of money to them, right? They were making more money than their parents were in the fields doing that. So they're helping the family supplement their income. And then December 7th comes around, 1941, and now they're right in the middle of World War II. So a lot of that, and now many of these guys were also serving in the CCC camps, the Civilian Conservation Corps, during the Great Depression, right? So they were trying to get the people back to work, and they had these young people working. A lot of these were set up like military camps. So this was nothing new to these guys. They had already gone through the CCC camps as youths. Then they were in part of the Texas National Guard, and now they find themselves smack in the middle of World War II.
Right. Wow. And they come from different parts of Texas. You mentioned El Paso, of course. You mentioned Del Rio. Um, what might you have learned about their experience with? I mean, let's face it, Texas was segregated at the time, so it's not a shock that the company was also segregated. But in terms of the variety of experiences, are we talking about all guys who are working class? You mentioned some of their parents would have been working in the fields. What is the variation that we see among these guys in the company?
Well, from El Paso, again, an original Texas National Guard unit out of El Paso. So El Paso had a lot of mix. You know, people were working in the industry, all kinds of things. And then when they started drafting people into the U.S. Army, and that's when my cousin Ramon comes over. He's from Del Rio, Texas. You had people from Kingsville, Texas. Pedro T. Soto, tragically killed at Mount Rotundo. He gave his life on Mount Rotundo, and he's from Kingsville, Texas. You had people down there from the Brownsville area, a lot from Dallas area, San Antonio. So when they started coming into the unit, if they were of Mexican American descent, if they had room, they got thrown into Company E. Company E maintained a 100% Mexican American unit all the way up until they started taking casualties in World War II.
And do we know of any other units that were all Mexican American?
Not like this one, no. No,
Okay.
that's what
Wow.
makes them unique. I mean, we
Right.
had Mexican Americans serving in the Navy, in the Marines, and in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Alfredo Paredes from Del Rio, Texas, was serving in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and he had volunteered for a mission that he wasn't even assigned to, but because the pilot that he knew was going to fly his first mission, he wanted to volunteer. They were shot down over Vietnam when they were bombing Japanese freighters, and his body was never recovered. So he was lost.
In the process of doing the research on all these different guys in the company, and you mentioned you talked to a lot of different family members, have these folks ever met each other?
Some of them have met each other, but a lot of them hadn't. And even some of the people in El Paso. So when Company E, after World War II, those that survived and came back from the POW camps, and really after medical, because a lot of them were wounded, they all came back to the El Paso area. And Gabriel Navarrete, who was a leader of that group from El Paso, he was the veterans officer in the city of El Paso. They formed what they called a Company E club, and these guys would have dances at the local VFW, which the VFW hall was named after Rocky Segura, who was killed in action in El Paso. So they all stayed together and helped one another and things like that. So they did stay together in the area in El Paso.
That's really neat. I just imagine having gone through something like that together, it would really uh, create a forever bond there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the most unbroken bonds that you that I have ever seen or witnessed, is when men go together in combat together. It's really unbroken, that bond, because
Yeah.
they've been through literally hell.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me a little bit more about the experience that they had overseas, because you mentioned they went to a bunch of places.
Yes.
So maybe you can just walk us through that a little bit more.
Sure. So here we are. We have all these men from the Barrios of Texas training in the National Guard, and then December 7th, 1941. Now they're in the middle of World War II. The unit gets moved to Camp Blanding, Florida, and they start training out there. They took part in the Carolina maneuvers, and by 1942, they find themselves in, of all places, Massachusetts at Camp Edwards. Now,
Cold.
yeah, and you're in Yankee country, and you got all these kids from the barrios of Texas in Yankee country. But one of the things that they found out when they were up there is they would go out on leave, and there were no signs that said no Mexicans or dogs allowed in the stores. They really felt like Americans for the first time as they were out there, because that's not what they were experiencing back home for sure, um, in the Barrios of Texas during this time. So they go through Camp Edwards, and at Camp Edwards, they actually go through what something new that the U.S. Army was calling Ranger training. And the U.S. Army had actually brought over British commandos to train them in commando ranger tactics that the U.S. Army was calling Ranger training now. And they became only the second unit to do that kind of training. They ship out to North Africa in April of 1943. They continue to train in North Africa. And in September of 1943, they land at Salerno, Italy. They actually spearhead, the 36th Division spearheads the Allied landing at Italy and becomes the first unit to oppose Hitler's Nazi forces on the European continent. Now, when they land at Salerno is when my cousin Ramon is awarded the Silver Star for his actions at Salerno, Italy. They land at Salerno, one of the first units to hit the beaches. No artillery has landed yet, and they run into 5 enemy tanks. Well, my cousin Ramon sees a couple of the men killed in Company E right in front of him. And he would later tell his grandson Henry that he didn't think he was going to make it that day, so he didn't care what happens to him at this point. He was going to try to take out as many people as he could with him. So he charges a German machine gun nest and gets shot in the arm, loses his Browning automatic rifle. He continues without a rifle to try to outflank the machine gun nest and throws a hand grenade into the nest, and he killed the 3 German soldiers. He then jumped into the foxhole and killed the last German soldier with a knife in hand-to-hand combat. So he's awarded the Silver Star for that action and actually broke open the way for the rest of the unit to go through because they were pinned down at the time. And a Russian officer was there with them, with the U.S. Army, because the Russians are now wanting to see what the U.S. Army and the British are doing in this new front in Italy. They sent over an observer because he's there to see what the Americans and the British are going to do in this new front. Well, the Russian officer overhears what my cousin has done, and he says, this is the kind of action that will inspire our men on the Eastern Front. And he puts in for a medal for my cousin. And in May of 1944, the Russian ambassador presents to the Secretary of State Cordell Hull a medal for my cousin Ramon. He's awarded the Order of Patriotic War, 2nd degree, by the Soviet Union.
Wow.
So
Wow.
they're at Salerno. They continue to fight at Mount Rotundo. They fought at San Pietro, in the village of San Pietro, that's famously filmed by John Ford. And after San Pietro, they find themselves 1 mile from the Rapido River. And they have orders to cross a heavily defended river at the Gustav Line in Italy in January of 1944. In a span of 48 hours, the 36th Division would lose nearly 2,000 men in its attempt to cross the Rapido River in Italy in January of 1944. Most of the unit was decimated there. The 141st and 143rd Infantry was basically wiped out. And my cousin Ramon happened to be one of only 27 men to come back from Company E. They crossed with 154 men that day. Only 27 of them came back.
Wow.
After the Rapido River fiasco, the 36th Division continued to fight near Cassino. They were pulled from the line and went to Anzio. and were there at the Battle of Vellatri. Now, my cousin, being only one of 27 guys that are still with the unit, is made a sergeant. He went from private first class to sergeant. He's he's one of only a few guys with combat experience, right? So he's made a sergeant, and he's leading an advanced squad at Vellatri near Rome, and his unit is overrun and he's taken prisoner. This time, Ramon is taken prisoner, and he's being led in the back. He's being stabbed in the back with a bayonet because he's not walking fast enough. He's being held in a building for a few days and being tortured. And an Allied bomb hit the building where he was at. And through the confusion, there's a hole in the wall now with the bombing. He gets out. Italian villagers hid him for a few days until the Americans came through, and then Ramon went back. He spent many months in a hospital before he was ready to go back to his unit. And he's thinking he's ready to go back to the unit. They're getting ready to land in France now, and they tell him, "Oh no, you're not going there. We're going to send you back home because the Russians gave you a medal, and we need you to go to Washington, D.C. and pick up a medal." So the Secretary of State, Cordell Hall, awards him the Russian medal in Washington, D.C.
Wow. Yeah. And how old was he about?
So Ramon first enlisted at 18. And this is 1941.
Yeah. So he would have been about 2021.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. All of that happening in his life and at that age.
Wow. We have an audience question that he wants to know. This is Mr. Herrera. Was that group known as the Blue Devils, as called by the Germans? That could have been somebody else.
Yes, the 36th Division would later the German officers would later call them the Blue Devils because they saw them everywhere. They showed the 36th Division showed up everywhere. They had landed at Salerno, had fought them all through the central mountains of Italy. They crossed the Gustav line at the Rapido River, and then they're defending Anzio and Vellatri, and there they were again. So they were called different names by the Germans for sure. Yeah. And while we're talking about that, some of the guys that had been captured, Ricardo Palacios of El Paso, Ernesto Cortazar, also of El Paso, was captured. So these guys get captured and they start talking Spanish to each other,
yeah.
Ahora ¿qué nos va a pasar ahora? Now that they're prisoners, and they're talking to themselves. And the Germans are scratching their heads saying, when did Mexico enter the war? They thought they were Mexican from Mexico.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, I'm glad you brought up Mexicans from Mexico because we have another question here about Squadron 201. The question is, was that an all-Mexican squadron, or did it also have non-Mexican pilots? I know that's a different topic than what you're talking about, but if you're familiar.
Yes, I am familiar with Squadron 201. They flew P-47s, and they were from Mexico. They were actually from Mexico. They were not Mexican Americans, but they were from Mexico. And they actually, I believe, they flew out of the Philippines.
Okay. Yeah. I think they trained at one point in San Antonio.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think when they arrived back from overseas, they ended up at Laughlin or something. And I remember there was a lot of ads going on about, the squadron coming through. I remember people reading about that.
Yeah. Mr. Herrera just adds to his comment about the Blue Devils that they wore a blue patch and that they, I guess, sound like the devil, said the Germans. Another little tidbit there. Okay. So Wow. So they saw an enormous amount of action, and unfortunately, they also experienced some very high losses.
Right.
Um, this story that you share in your book has now been featured at a couple of major museums. The I'm so sorry, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, which is
Right.
probably one of the most impressive of our military history museums in the country. And now you are a member of the National Medal of Honor Museum's advisory panel. This is a new museum that's going to be actually here in Texas. Um, I was saying to Dave before we got started with the live stream how important it is that these stories about Mexican Americans and their contributions to our nation get told in venues that are national in scope, and where perhaps Mexican Americans aren't always at the forefront of the stories. So, can you just tell us a little bit more about your experience being able to take this story to spaces like that?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, it is very important. It's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. Now, I was not ever taught any of this in school, right? None of us were taught any of this in school about Mexican American contributions to World War II. And we know from our families that we were part of World War II. We served, our families have served. We know that, yet our stories are not out there. And that is one of the biggest things that I'm trying to change, is to make sure that we get our stories out there. It's one of the biggest things that it's a challenge for us, that we need to change. We have to get our stories out there. We need to record and document our own history, because this is one example of that. Why did it take 70 years for someone to write this story? This story really should have been written 50 years ago, and
Mhm.
I wish it had been. Um, but yeah, to be able to go to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, um, a good friend of mine now, because he was part of that, the National World War II, Ed Lang, was there at the National World War II Museum. He said, Dave, I definitely, we read your book and we definitely want you to come out here. And then we were scheduled to go in 2020, and then COVID hits. And
Mm.
so that set us back. But then 2 or 3 years later, I happened to be on the advisory panel to the National Medal of Honor Museum, and I meet the chairman of the National World War II Museum, who's also on the panel, and we get to talking, and he goes, Dave, I have to get you out there. I have to get you out to the National World War II Museum, and that's how I was able to get out there. And I've since been back a few times to the National World War II Museum. I was there at meet the author and presented the book. And then they had me do a presentation for their international conference. And then while I was there, they went ahead and filmed me for a new segment that they had, World War II in 2 minutes. There's a little subject. So I went ahead and filmed that for them. So yeah, great exposure. Great to be able to tell our stories like that. And again, so when I went to the National Medal of Honor Museum, and by the way, it's already opened in
Oh,
Arlington. It opened in March, um, because they wanted to take a look at, when they're exhibiting Latinos in the museum, they wanted my input on that. So great that people are actually thinking of that now, right?
yeah, yeah.
They're like, wait a minute, shouldn't we have somebody in here to give us a guideline on that? So kudos to the National World War II Museum, and kudos to the National Medal of Honor Museum in Arlington, Texas.
Absolutely, because it wasn't that long ago. Some of our viewers may remember this. that there was a big World War II documentary made for PBS and Latinos got left out
Yes, and I wrote
until
about that. I did write about that in my book because
Mhm,
it was during that time that I was already starting to do research. And when I realized, and we can talk about it, because I pull no punches. I say Ken Burns and PBS did this 14-hour documentary, and not 1 second is mentioned of Latinos' contributions in World War II. Not 1 second. Now, 500,000 Latinos served in World War II, and we couldn't find a couple of minutes. I mean, that really lit a fire under me to make sure that I wrote this book and got
mhm,
it out there. And I used it as a little fuel to get me to write this book. And when I was writing, again, this is the first time I'd written a book. So what I did is I had a little photo of my cousin Ramon, and I put it right by my bed. Every night when I went to bed, I would see that picture, and it would remind me, what did you do for him today? Right.
mm,
And then I would wake up the next morning, and what's the first thing I see? Ramon right there. And I'll ask myself, what are you going to do for him today? You know, so that really kept me going and motivated me every day.
mhm,
My screensaver was the photo of the you see behind me. That was my screensaver. So every time I opened my laptop, I saw those faces of these men. What are you going to do for them today, Dave,
mhm,
to get their story told? And
mhm,
really, and that's what really fueled me to finally be able to get their story done. And I self-published the book originally uh, in 2014 because really I lacked the confidence to go over to a publisher and say, "Hey, I have this book." Right? I'm a
mhm,
first-time writer. Yeah, they're going to listen to you, Dave. And really, I should have been more confident. Uh, but later on, I had a publisher pick it up a little bit later.
wonderful. Oh, well, wonderful. And also, I just think it's such a good lesson. Don't get mad, get busy, right?
Yeah,
When right. Don't get mad,
yeah,
get busy. Um, You talked about your cousin being from Del Rio, and of course, Del Rio is known for a number of civil rights issues. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the school segregation in Del
yes,
Rio. Yeah.
yeah. Because what I wanted to do, and I wrote about it in the book because I wanted people to understand what these men went throughout their whole lives, right? Not just World War II, because they grew up during the Great Depression. Uh,
Mhm,
so I mean, they're called the greatest generation for a reason. They lived through the Great Depression. Uh, these guys in particular were segregated. They weren't allowed to go to the other schools because they were segregated in a barrio where they weren't allowed to go to the other school.
mhm,
So in 1930 in Del Rio, Texas, uh, they were gonna they were gonna go ahead and open up a couple of new buildings on the campus, and on that campus they had a special school building set aside for the Mexican kids because they weren't being taught with the other kids. And what they did is they had this appropriations where they were going to get new funds, and what they were going to do is they were going to say, well, we're going to do this with the money, and we're going to add more rooms to that Mexican school also. Well, the parents said thought to themselves, well, if you're going to add more rooms, you're always going to keep us segregated. And Jesus Salvaterra, who was a parent of two of his children were in that school, and they filed a lawsuit and saying, wait a minute, there's nothing in the law that says you can segregate Mexican kids from the other kids.
Mhm.
And they went ahead and filed a lawsuit. LULAC got involved. So there was a big trial, and they actually won the case. This was the first case brought against a Texas school district on the segregation of Mexican American children. And very few people realize that this happened in Del Rio, Texas. And what obviously happened is they went ahead and the school appealed it to the state, and then during the appeals, they gave it back. They awarded it back to the school, saying they're not segregating them because they're Mexican. They're segregating them because they're behind in their classes, because they're gone half the time doing field work with their parents. And it is true. They did leave school at certain times because that's how they made their money.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting how so many Mexican Americans who were in World War II experienced these things back home, these uh, not just segregation, but just being completely excluded from
Mm-hmm.
basic rights,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then go off to fight for their country,
Yes.
see their friends, in some cases not make it home, right? Uh, and yet serve honorably. Um, Many Mexican Americans did receive various medals, and that does not, receiving the medals is not, the full measure of your patriotism by any means.
Right.
But we do know that many Mexican American soldiers were highly decorated in the war,
Mm-hmm.
and then came back to having to deal with ongoing segregation and those sorts of things. Yes,
Yes.
but in many cases, they took action, right? They organized. We do have a question here about the number of Mexican Americans awarded the Medal of Honor. The question is, um, are Mexican Americans, have they been awarded more Medal of Honor than any other ethnic group? Do we know that?
Yes, that is true. That is
Wow.
true. 61 Latino Americans or Hispanic Americans have been awarded the Medal of Honor. Now we just had the Marine Corps' 250th birthday.
Mm-hmm.
13 Latino Americans who have worn the uniform of the United States Marine Corps were awarded the Medal of Honor. Yes, so 61 Latino Americans have been awarded the Medal of Honor.
Yeah,
That's more than any other ethnic group.
that's amazing. That is really amazing.
Today,
Mhm.
today, the United States Marine Corps today says that nearly 28% of their fighting force is Latino American. That is a huge number. And that number is only going to grow.
Wow, it really is. That's amazing. I'm writing that down. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so something really exciting happened here. I've got even a picture. Um, you made a Hollywood connection.
Oh,
There's there
yes.
there you are with Wilber Valderrama.
Yes.
Can you tell us about this?
Yes. So I originally self-published the book in 2014, and Wilmer's actually holding the cover of my original book,
Put it back up.
original cover of my book. So Patriots, the word Patriots is in the American flag, and the word Barrio is in the Mexican flag. It's when you self-publish, you have to design you do everything. You market it. After you write it, then the hard work comes. You have to market it. You have to do everything. So for the next couple of years, I was just trying to get the story out there. I'm writing articles. I'm trying to get them published. I had subscribed to this very famous World War II magazine because I've been always an avid World War II fan and reader of history. And so I wrote this article and I sent it to the publisher of the magazine. And this, again, is one of my favorite magazines. And, I asked if they would think about publishing this article. And I got a flat out rejection. Like, no, thank you. We're not interested in that. I'm like, well, dang, I got crushed for a while there. And then my cousin Henry, who was on Facebook, he posted something about war history online, an article. And I thought, war history online? I'd never even heard of them. So I looked at them. They had 1 million followers on Facebook alone. And then they had their own website. That same rejected article, I didn't even change it. I just sent it to them. Mm-hmm. And within a week, they published it with me as a guest writer.
Wow.
Right? That article, someone showed Wilmer Valderrama that article in Hollywood. And they said, hey, Wilmer, we know you do things for the USO. You help out veterans. You should read this article. And Wilmer said, Dave, I grabbed a cup of tea and I went to sit down and I didn't stop until I finished your entire article. He said, I then came back to my production team. He goes, hey, I want you guys all to read this. Let's find the book. Let's read it. And then find me that writer. And lo and behold, I get emails and then I'm corresponding with his production team. I flew out to LA to meet with Wilmer, and Wilmer Valderrama's production company picked up the film rights to my book. They have plans to do either a television series or a feature film on it. And now CBS TV Studios is on board.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's very exciting. That's very exciting. I know things like that can take a while to come to fruition, but when it does, I want to figure out a way that we have some kind of screening in San Antonio.
Oh, yeah.
Military City, USA, we have to do it. So that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I know we're kind of running up towards the end of the hour, so I just want to tell our viewers, if you do have a question, and please put it in the chat. I do see a comment here. There was definitely a gap between the doctrine of democracy the U.S. was promoting abroad and the continued forms of discrimination they experienced at home. Yeah. And there's also some commentary about the potential political process of getting a medal, and that he's theorizing that we probably lost out on some medals because of that.
Yes, absolutely. And to bring you up to date on my cousin Ramon, just this past year, Wes Verdell, who is a Texas congressman, nominated my cousin Ramon for the Texas Medal of Honor. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool. Let's see. So I know this book has found an audience, and I guess maybe what I would love to know is just, what are some things you've heard about from people who've read it or people who've learned about it? We heard about Wilmer's reaction, but I'm thinking about other veterans or family members of veterans. What kind of response have you heard?
Yeah, so one of the big ones, it would be hearing from veterans themselves and saying, finally, you're giving us a voice, that this is something that should have been done a long time ago. And I agree with them. I mean, really, it should have been done years ago. And as I'm doing research, I find out that people like Raul Morin, who had written a book, Among the Valiant, who talked about Latino veterans, and he did mention Company E in a few paragraphs and things like that. in the book Among the Valiant. But I definitely paid kudos to Raul Morin in my book. Anything that I read, I definitely did. Uh, for me, the important piece is to hear from the veterans themselves
Mhm.
and the family members,
Mhm.
because they're the ones that really sacrificed a lot. And I learned a lot about that going through on this journey. Uh, because I connected with these families, and it's heartbreaking to hear their story that they never saw their uncle again, you know, and many of them never even knew what happened to them. Where did they die and things like that. And one in particular, Lorenzo Macias, uh, from El Paso, Texas, was killed in action. And I knew about uh, Lorenzo. However, I was not able to write clearly about him in the first edition because I didn't have that info
Mm.
from the family. So I really couldn't just guess.
Mhm.
So I really couldn't write about him in the first edition of the book. And then lo and behold, his niece Elena Macias goes and reads an article that I wrote about it. She goes, "This sounds all too familiar. This is like my Theo Lor's unit." And sure enough, it was. And when she sent me an email, I'm like, "Please tell me you're related to Lorenzo Macias." And she said, "Yes, that's my uncle." Now, she had not known about what happened to him in Italy. He was killed in action 2 days before Christmas,
Mhm.
1943. And all she grew up in a house in El Paso with his photo above the chimney.
Yeah.
It was there. Um, I tell people, you walk into a Latino house and you're going to see two things. You're going to see the Virgen de Guadalupe on the wall, and you're going to see all the family members that have served this country.
Mhm.
That's what you're going to find in a Latino house. Um, and lo and behold, Elena made the trip to Italy to see where her Dio Lor is still buried in
Oh,
Italy.
wow.
He never made it back home,
Oh,
but she
wow.
went and made the trek, followed the same steps through from Salerno on to San Pietro, where he was killed in action.
Wow. Wow. Okay, the last question we have, I think, from the audience is: are there any oral histories of these men?
Yes, there are some of them. Rafael Torres has some. Um, Ricardo Palacios had some, so those were very helpful once I found those.
Yeah.
Um, and there was one of the officers who was still alive when I was writing the book. I actually flew to Massachusetts and interviewed him. So a lot of what happened to William Barker is in the book in detail because I got it straight from him.
Hmm. That's amazing. Well, what a story. And I'm so glad it's been picked up by so many different outlets, and that we're all looking forward to seeing what comes out of the production of
Yep.
this. And we'll be happy to support that when it comes out. So thank you so much for being with us here on Veterans Day. I do want to just share with our audience that there are a couple of things coming down the pipeline that we would love for you to participate in. So currently at the MACRI Visitor Center, we have our exhibit Cisneros versus Corpus Christi ISD. The long fight to end school segregation exhibit is on view now through November 26th. And then that will be closing because we'll be opening a new exhibit, which, if I can get it up here, can I make it work? Let's see. I apologize. We're having a little technical issue here. Well, we have a new exhibit opening on December the 5th about a World War II veteran. Oh, here we go. Here we go. William
Wow.
Merriweather Pena. Up there on the top left, you see him in his army uniform. He was in the Battle of the Bulge and a bunch of other. He saw quite a bit of action. He ended up losing a part of a leg to a landmine And then he persevered, and he became probably the most important Mexican-American architect of the 20th century. So we'll be telling that story in our next exhibit. Very excited. I just finished up a research trip to Texas A&M to finish up the research for that. You're just going to love this story, y'all. It's so good. And of course, we've always got new events coming down the pipeline. Please go to our website at www.somosmacri.org to find out about our next programs. And yeah, we are trying to build the first National Mexican-American Civil Rights History Museum right here in San Antonio, the cradle of Mexican-American civil rights. And so you'll want to keep up with all the news about that. Please go to our website and subscribe to our newsletter so you can keep up with that. Again, Dave, thank you so much. What a wonderful story. Thank you for taking time out of Veterans Day to be here with us tonight. Thank you all of the folks watching from home. We want to send a special thank you to all the veterans, and thank you for your service, and thank you for your sacrifice. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.